Hello and welcome to a new video. This is for Algebra 1. We are doing a new unit which is on solving quadratic equations. We've had our first lesson which is on solving using square roots, and we're ready for a second lesson which is solving by factoring. So this is going to be partially an explanation of why factoring is a thing that we care about. And then also factoring is going to be around for a while. You're going to see it again in geometry probably, and algebra 2 definitely, and really any math after this, it will come up. So definitely something we want to remember how to do. So let's just warm up real quick with a couple of factoring problems. These are both quadratic trinomials, and so that means they're going to split into two parentheses. And what we want to do is we want to say, hey, what multiplies to get negative 14 that adds to get negative 5? So to get negative 14 would be like 7 and 2, but one of them needs to be negative, and so we do negative 7 plus 2 to get a negative 5. So this is going to be, it doesn't matter which order you put it in, but x minus 7 and x plus 2 would be our answer. So the second one here, the first one didn't have anything in front of x squared, which is why we were able to go straight to our parentheses. But this one has a 2 in front, so we can try to guess and check by saying, okay, how do I split up 2x squared here and here? And how do I split 12 up here and here? But especially since 12 has a lot of possibilities, that could take us a while to come up with the right answer. So I'm going to use the box method. The other method you might use is slide and divide or split the middle term. And they all work really similarly. But I'm going to do 2 times 12, which is 24. And I'm going to say, what multiplies to get 24 that adds to get negative 11? And that's going to be a negative 3 plus a negative 8. Because they multiply to get positive 24. They add to get negative 11. So then we're going to put this in our boxes. So we put the 2x squared in the top left, we put the 12 in the bottom right, and then we do negative 3x and negative 8x. So we look at the top two, and they have an x in common. Look at these bottom two, they have a 4 in common. We look at the left two, they have a 2x in common. Look at the right two, they have a 3 in common. But I have a sign issue here because these two negatives on our diagonal mean that actually both of these are going to need to be negative, because that's how we're going to end up multiplying to get the signs we need. Like that 2x times negative 4 gives us negative 8x, and negative 3 times negative 4 gives us 12, and negative 3 times x gives us negative 3x. That's how that is supposed to work. So our two parentheses are 2x minus 3 and x minus 4. And so see how this 2x squared is split into 2x and x. The 12 is split up into negative 3 and negative 4. So if you're like, oh, that's what I would have guessed, then maybe you should try the guess and check method. But yeah, I don't know how much I can stress this enough. I only used guess and check until I became a teacher. And now I very rarely just straight up use guess and check because it makes me frustrated really fast. So okay, the question that we're going to raise in this section is, how do we solve something like this equation? It's got an x squared, but it also has an x term, and that's what makes it different from the first lesson we went over. And so there are a few things that, with your current knowledge, if I'm assuming that you haven't actually solved an equation like this before, there are a few things that I would expect you would try. So one of those would be to say, well, I know I need to subtract the 2 over because we always get our x's on one side and our numbers on the other. So that would be something I would expect you to suggest or try. And it's like, yeah, that didn't feel like it was super helpful. We cannot add x squared and 3x together and get a single x. We're not allowed to divide by x because of a lot of reasons, but that's not a thing that we do to solve equations. So we can't do that. That's not gonna end up helping us, for one thing, because it gives us negative 2 over x over here on the right side, and what are we supposed to do with that? And so once we've kind of tried all the different things we can think of, we might come to the conclusion of, okay, well, we can't solve this the way we solve linear equations, but you may notice that this looks like something we can factor. And the title of this lesson is Solve by Factoring. So let's factor this and then try to figure out why in the world that would be helpful. So to factor this, we're going to ignore the equals 0 and factor into two parentheses, but then we're going to write equals 0 next to it. So that's how that works. We want to think what multiplies to get 2 that adds to get 3. So that would be a 2 and a 1. Now, here's why that's helpful. Because we've got it written out this way, we're saying that this times this equals 0. But if you have two things that you are multiplying together and they equal 0, that means one of these two things, or both, have to be 0. The only way to multiply and get 0 is for the first number to be 0, for the second number to be 0, or for them both to be 0. Those are our options. This is called the zero product property or something to that effect, that when we're multiplying two things together that we know equals 0, we can separate what we have into different equations and say, okay, what makes these different parts be 0? And that gives us our answer. So what that looks like is I'm going to do x plus 2, which is the first parentheses, equals 0. And I'm going to do x plus 1 equals 0. And I'm going to solve these. And these are actually really easy to solve because all I have to do is think, I'm going to subtract 2 and get x equals -2. Notice we don't have an x squared because the squared went away when we factored. So we're not having to square root at all. We're just saying I factored it into two linear things, and now I can take those linear things and set them equal to 0 and solve. So this one I'm going to have -1 on both sides and get x equals -1. So this time, like in our first lesson, we got a bunch of answers that were like positive and -5. In this section, we're probably not going to have that situation happen because our answers are probably going to be two completely different numbers. So in this case, we've got -2 and -1. We can't write those together, so we just write them separately. So what we're saying is that if you put a -2 where x is, so you square it and then you do 3 times it and then plus 2, we're saying that equals 0. But we're saying there's another number that also works. We're saying -1 squared plus 3 times -1 plus 2. That also equals 0. There are two things that end up giving us 0. And so you can do it this maybe really quickly in your head. I don't know if you can or not, but I can. Like 4 minus 6 is -2 plus 2 is 0. Yeah, -2 really does give us 0. -1 squared would be 1. 3 times -1 is -3, so that's 1 minus 3, which is -2. Plus 2 is 0. So these both give us 0. And the way we figured that out was we said, hey, this is something that I can factor, and then I can split it up so that I have actually two equations to solve. So that's the process of solving by factoring. We're going to do some examples here, and yeah, it'll be great. Example 1, these are just going to be the easier type of factoring quadratic expressions where there's not a number in front of x squared, so we can go straight to our parentheses. So this isn't really that much different than the one we just did. We need to say, hey, what multiplies to get -20? That adds to get 8. So let's see, 10 and 2, but what needs to be negative? I want it to be a positive 8, so I'm going to do plus 10 and -1. If you're still having trouble with factoring, then that's definitely something that you should work on. Don't put it off till later because, like I said, factoring is just going to keep coming back and coming back and coming back. And I think for most people, it just kind of takes, like, all of a sudden it clicks, so you have to be willing to practice enough to get to that point where it clicks. So we're going to say, well, what would make x plus 10 equal 0, and what would make x minus 1 equal 0? Now, I can sit here and write this out, that I'd minus 10, and get x equals -10. But you should notice after doing a few of these, or maybe you've already noticed, that it ends up being what's in the parentheses, but with the opposite sign. So when we factored, we got a plus 10 and a negative 1. But then when we solve it, we actually get the opposite, which is negative 10 and positive 1. So let's look at B. If you, you should try this on your own. You should pause and try it and then see if you're right. If you're feeling good about it. We're going to factor and say what multiplies to get 32? That adds to get 12. That would be 4 and 8. So then we're going to take each of these and set them equal to 0. If you do feel confident that you've got this next step down, you could skip writing down some of this. Just don't completely skip it. Like, don't skip this line, because in order for you to be able to say you solved by factoring, you need to actually factor it. So without that line, it kind of looks like you just cheated and wrote down answers. So x equals negative 4 and x equals negative 8 are our two answers. So hopefully that's all well and good. This is a thing where we're gonna learn how to do this with any quadratic equation, because there's lots of quadratic equations actually that you cannot factor. So this is very situational, that if we look at a quadratic equation and we notice that we can factor it, then it's actually the fastest way to solve it. It's faster than the next way we're going to talk about. But especially when we have these where we've got to slide and divide or use the box method, it may end up that you're going to just try a different method, and that's fine. But for now, I'm telling you, hey, you can factor these, so we're going to factor them and see what happens. I will use slide and divide on this first one, for all those out there that are doing slide and divide. Now, there's a tricky thing here with slide and divide, and the reason there's actually people who don't like slide and divide, like are very, very opposed to it, because you're not actually allowed to slide the 2 over to the 14. And that way, that's not correct math. And if you were to write equals 0 here, implying that, that this is a continued thought and these equal each other, that's actually incredibly wrong. That does not equal 0. This is a trick we're doing, basically, so that we can figure out what the factors are. And I'll show you where we can put back the equals 0. So now, what multiplies to get 28 but adds to get 11? That would be 7 and 4. And then we slid. Now we got to divide by this 2. And by divide, I mean divide. So if it doesn't divide, we move the 2 in front. And if it does divide or simplify, we go ahead and do that. 4 over 2 is 2. So slide and divide helps us factor it. And so once we have it back in our factors, we set it equal to 0. And then we say, okay, I'm going to set each of these parentheses equal to 0. And this is where, if you're like, oh, well, I've been doing it in my head, you're going to have to maybe stop and say, can I still do this in my head? It's not impossible, but look at this 2n plus 7 equals 0. We're actually going to need to subtract 7 and then divide by 2. And so we get n equals negative 7/2. And then subtract 2 and get n equals negative 2. So there we go. And then I'll use the box method on B, so that we see that method as well. So 5 times negative 8 is negative 40. And so we're saying, what multiplies to get negative 40? That adds to get negative 6. 4 and 10, and the 10 would have to be negative. So I'm going to make my big box with other boxes inside. You might say it looks like a window, like the kind of window you draw on a very generic house. That's just like made out of a square and a triangle. You know what I'm talking about? No? Okay. The top has a y in common. The bottom has a negative 2 in common. The left side has 5y in common. The right side has 4 in common. So this gives us 5y plus 4 and y minus 2. So we set each part of this equal to 0. So definitely the hardest part of this is the factoring part of it, right? So 5y plus 4 equals 0, and y minus 2 equals 0. So I'm going to subtract 4, 5y equals negative 4, divide by 5, and y equals negative 4/5. We don't need to change that to a decimal. We can just leave it as negative 4/5. So then add 2 for this one, and we get 2. So the trickiness here is being able to factor this, and then there is a little bit more trickiness on these with solving them. But we still end up with something linear, so it should still be equations that are fairly familiar to us. And that's the whole shebang for solving by factoring. And so thanks for watching. Give me a like if you don't mind, and subscribe if you haven't already. And I'll see you in the next video. It's gonna be totally great. Bye.